Kedves 11-esek, eljött az összefoglalás ideje. A két háború közti időszakból fogunk témazáró dolgozatot írni, és az összefoglalást azt megpróbáltam összeszedni a legfontosabb ábrák segítségével, hogy mi mindenre kell emlékezni. Ez egy nagyon komplex téma, de nagyon sok érettségi témakör van benne. Tehát ezért, mivel elég komplex, két részre osztottam, tehát az összefoglalásból 2 óra lesz tulajdonképpen. Ez tehát az első, Interwar period. But at first, we talked about the serious economic crisis, which is not the Great Depression, the serious crisis right after the First World War. And as you see, these numbers, we are after the First World War. The USA was the fastest growing economy in the world. Germany shrank, Great Britain shrank, Russia was in serious problems because of the Civil War, French economy collapsed. So actually the biggest component, the greatest economic power was the USA. And of course, in the next picture, we also see that during the war, Russia was in the deepest problem in industrialism, and of course, the highest is always America, and the others are shrinking, so they cannot keep the pace with USA. So the problem is, how will the winners get the reparations, and how will America get back the loans from the winners? And this is how in 1924, Charles Dawes came up with the Dawes Plan, which actually restarted the German economy, because Germany wanted to pay the reparation, but actually they couldn't. France started the invasion of the Rhine region, but actually they went bankrupt in this military action. So in the 1920s, beginning of 1920s, nothing happened and there was serious crisis. So the Dawes Plan did that American investors restarted with loans and investments the German economy, and when the Germans started to produce things, they could pay the reparation to Britain and France, and they could pay the loans back to the USA. It was a fantastic idea, and they restarted everything. But we also have to remember that after the First World War, as time passed, extreme political parties appeared and became more and more popular. The communists on the extreme left and the fascist and Nazi extreme right was born. And of course, after the war, a kind of forced social democrat and forced civilian parties started to get power in Europe, and this means that some moderate democratic parties were taking power in Germany and France and everywhere. And of course, after the Dawes Plan, these extremes couldn't grow. The economic crisis will result in the growth of the political extremes, that's what we said. Of course, when the Great Depression came, that is when we see how, for example, extreme right grew in Europe. Of course, as time passed, Germany had to be friended with the former enemies. So in the German territories, the Weimar Republic took power. That was the political leadership. This was a republic of a kind of very colorful parties, a kind of coalition government with the cooperation of moderate parties, no extremes, but actually there was no political support behind it. It was a kind of artificial power. But Stresemann was at that time the Chancellor of Germany and the foreign minister as well before that, and they started the appeasement policy, so they wanted to pay the reparation, and those plans helped in that. Of course, in the following, you will see that different agreements were signed as Germany became ally or actually friend of the countries. Like with the Soviet Union, they signed the Rapallo Agreement in 1922, and both countries agreed that they won't fight and actually they don't want reparation payment from each other. You remember it was Germany who defeated the Soviets and the Brest-Litovsk peace treaty, but after the war Germany lost the war, so actually Soviet Union was winner and they didn't want the reparation from each other. Locarno Agreement was more important because it was about the western border of Germany. So they strengthened the border here. This is the so-called Locarno Agreement in 1955. And as you remember, Germany was invited to the League of Nations. The Kellogg-Briand Pact was also about keeping peace and avoiding any kind of war in the following. So Europe and the world was ready to keep long-term peace. Of course, it was impossible because of these territorial losses and serious nationalist problems, but they wanted to keep that. And of course, the Young Plan was finally given the number Germany has to pay as reparation. 114 billion marks had to be paid by Germany in a long-term payment, but they agreed and appeasement policy went on. In Central Europe, the surrounding countries around Hungary created the Little Entente between 1920-21. Czechoslovakia, Romania, and the Serbian, Croatian, Slovenian kingdom around Hungary wanted to block our foreign policy, and of course they wanted to make Hungary really sorry. They wanted to keep Hungary without any power. So in Central Europe, these countries started their self-sufficient economies. They didn't want to cooperate with each other. They wanted to prove that they can survive alone. So between the two World War, the first part, the 20s, were like that, and we can say that the European economy could recover. We also talked about fascism, not very long, but remember that there is a disappointed winner of the First World War. Italy wanted a lot of influence in Europe because they were winners of the war, but actually in the Versailles peace treaties they didn't get actually anything. So that was problematic. Disappointment. Soldiers coming home from the front lines couldn't fit in the society, and this is how Mussolini, the former left-wing journalist, became a right-wing nationalist ideologist, and he became the duce of the country. You remember fasces. This is the symbol of fascism, which is an ancient Roman sign of power, the sign of the magistrates, the officials. And of course, Mussolini started ideological and military power. He created his black shirts. They marched to Rome and they took power. And Mussolini became the sole ruler and dictator of Italy. They annihilated all the political enemies, and they started a dictatorship which is based on nationalism, extreme nationalism, chauvinism. And he was a great speaker, and he created a dictatorship. He also settled the pact with the Vatican, the Lateran Pact, the Concordat, or Lateran Concordat, created the state, the Vatican City as the state, and of course, Roman Catholic became the state religion of Italy. Here is Mr. Mussolini showing himself as a very potent and strong person. We also should remember the Great Depression period. This is how the extremes got stronger, because Great Depression is about an overproduction crisis. It was in 1929 and lasted until 33. And of course, in this we can see all the causes, all the things which caused this overproduction crisis, and of course a lot of problems that resulted from it, like there was too many products and there was no one who wanted to buy them, so they started to selling things on the stock market, and the stock market collapsed because nobody wanted to buy anything. It was a chain reaction. As a chain reaction, a lot of people lost their jobs. As you see here, the unemployment rates, which were very high in Germany and every country that were in connection with with the USA. And as you see, the production fell immediately, and in Germany and in the USA, it was the deepest crisis in 32. Well, how they could solve it? In the USA, it was the New Deal. Mr. Keynes had the idea that because it is an overproduction crisis, it's only the state intervention can help. So the state must create jobs, but these jobs mustn't produce anything. What kind of things can it be? For example, working public works like building dams, building canals, and building railway lines and motorways. So this kind of public work do not produce any products. This brings a lot of jobs, or created a lot of jobs, and people had money, and this money was, of course, could be spent. And this is how development started. Mr. Roosevelt started and carried out the New Deal as his signing agreement about the New Deal. But in other countries, everything went differently. As the USA could keep democratic system, in other countries, political extremes got power, like in Germany and in the Soviet Union. Let's talk about the Soviet Union as Soviet communist dictatorship. Of course, there was the bloody civil war between the Reds and the Whites, as you remember. Started in 1917 and 18, and until 22 they were fighting. It was a serious war with a lot of people dead. The leader of the Reds, the Bolshevik party, was Lenin himself, and people were starving. There was no food. Lenin had to do something. They introduced the NAP, the new economic policy, which somehow recreated the market system so people could sell their surplus on the market and they could have some income. Money disappeared in Russia. It was a really dangerous period. And of course, the NAP was absolutely against the communist ideology. So as soon as it was the end of the Civil War, the NAP was withdrawn and the USSR was created. The USSR is the Soviet Union, a huge territory, which is a kind of federal state with a lot of member states who could, well, of course, theoretically they could leave the Soviet Union, but actually they couldn't, because if they leave the Soviet Union, they would be attacked. The sign of Soviet Union. And of course, in the Soviet Union, the most important ideology was communism. And Lenin said that communism can be created in a single country, and it will be Russia, the Soviet Union. We have to speak about the economic changes. First of all, everything is controlled by ideology. And ideology says that communism is about the leadership of the proletars. So the proletars, the working class, should be the leading layer. But in Russia, most of the people were peasants. So it was a problem. They started industrialization. They nationalized all the companies, every factory and everything. And they started increasing heavy industry and military industry. And of course, as you see, after the serious losses of the World War and the Civil War, they started a rapid growth in several industrial fields like heavy industry and military industry. They created planned economy. So they planned how much should be produced. Of course, these numbers were cheated, and the result was a serious problem that people didn't care about the quality. They just wanted to have the numbers, so they concentrated on the quantity of the goods, how much they have to produce. In this little picture, you may remember Stakhanov, the famous miner, whose numbers were cheated and became a hero. So working competitions and planned economy actually destroyed all fields of industry and agriculture except for heavy industry and military industry. So the problem was that people didn't have much to eat. If they produced a lot of agricultural stuff, they exported it to get money to make more weapons and more heavy industry. In agriculture, of course, what happened? They created the collectives, the so-called kolkhoz. They were forced to give in their lands and animals and tools and everything to the state. It was forced by the state to join the kolkhoz. Those who didn't want to join or had a little bit bigger land, they were called kulaks. They were hunted and they were sent to forced labor camps. So agriculture was collectivized. So as in industry we call it nationalization, in agriculture we call it collectivization. So actually by this and the compulsory delivery, people suffered a lot. You remember Holodomor, when in Ukraine, because of compulsory delivery, people had no food and millions of people died in the beginning of the 30s. And of course, rationing was introduced just like in serious cases, and life was impossible to live. And as Lenin died, Stalin took power and he continued this. So industrialization and collectivization, of course, is continuing. There was no private property anymore. Nationalization, as I told you. We haven't spoken about the terror. Stalin introduced terror. It became the power of the secret police, the NKVD, later KGB, actually arrested millions of people and they were sent to the Gulag, to forced labor camps. Millions of people, about 20 million people died in the Gulags in the 20th century. And of course, terror of the society, finding the enemies in the system, made it impossible to live. At the same time, a personal cult was created around Stalin. He became the perfect leader, and of course, he was the wisest person of the country. He knew everything. People had to praise him, and pictures, paintings, statues, everything was created about him. And this personal cult had to be followed by everyone. Even in your homes, you had to have the Stalin picture. So this is an irritating, demagogical, and really frightening, terrorized system was impossible to survive in. And at the same time, religions were hunted as well. Religion is absolutely against Bolshevism, so Christianity and Jewish religion and others were all hunted. So as the Soviet Union was created, Stalin created the terror and the personal cult, which Lenin started actually. So this is the end of the first interwar period revision.